We are confronting what may be the defining pathology of our age, a deep and systemic crisis of critical thought, a silent pandemic of cognitive passivity that is unraveling the very fabric of an informed and engaged society. This is not a simple matter of people being misinformed. It is a far more insidious process of intellectual disarmament, where the mind's innate tools for inquiry, skepticism, logic, evidence-based reasoning, and patient reflection are being systematically blunted and atrophied. We exist in a digital ecosystem meticulously engineered for distraction, a perpetual motion machine of outrage and stimulation that floods our cognitive channels with a fire hose of decontextualized information, compelling us to constantly react rather than to ever truly contemplate. This environment is compounded by an educational paradigm that, for generations, has often valued compliance over curiosity, teaching students what to think by presenting established answers rather than how to think by fostering rigorous questioning. The result is a citizenry trained for memorization and repetition, unprepared for the messy, ambiguous, and essential work of evaluating complex claims and constructing their own understanding. This fertile ground has given rise to a pervasive state of collective stupidity, a dangerous socio-cognitive phenomenon where individual reasoning is outsourced to the crowd, and truth is determined not by verifiable evidence, but by social consensus and emotional resonance. Within the insulated echo chambers of social media, algorithms create self-reinforcing feedback loops that affirm our biases, equating familiarity with accuracy and conflating group loyalty with intellectual validity. In this new reality, the demanding, often uncomfortable process of critical analysis, which requires the humility to admit uncertainty, the courage to challenge one's own assumptions, and the discipline to withstand cognitive dissonance, is being abandoned in favor of the swift, visceral gratification of tribal affirmation and moral certainty. We are becoming a society of reactive beings, where the speed of a tweet holds more power than the depth of a reasoned argument, and where the loudest voice, not the most substantiated one, wins the day. This mass surrender of intellectual autonomy does not merely lead to a few wrong opinions. It creates a profoundly vulnerable and malleable populace, one that is susceptible to manipulation by sophisticated disinformation campaigns, political demagoguery, and commercial exploitation, ultimately undermining the cornerstone of democratic life, the capacity of a people to make judicious, long-term decisions based on a shared, discernible reality. The decay of critical thinking is, therefore, not just an educational failure, but an existential threat, eroding our collective ability to solve complex global challenges, to hold power accountable, and to navigate the future with wisdom, leaving us adrift in a sea of information, yet perilously close to drowning in a storm of our own unexamined thoughts. Beneath the surface of our daily lives operates a vast and interlocking machinery of influence specifically designed to discourage deep scrutiny and independent judgment, forming what can be described as a soft authoritarianism of the mind. This systemic suppression begins in the foundational years within our educational institutions, which, still largely modeled on industrial-age factories, often prioritize standardization and compliance over intellectual curiosity. Students are routinely rewarded for memorizing predetermined answers and penalized for deviating from the curriculum, a process that systematically trains the cognitive muscles for repetition rather than for questioning, effectively teaching young minds what to think while neglecting the far more crucial skill of how to think. This conditioning is then seamlessly reinforced in adulthood by the architectural principles of the digital attention economy, where social media platforms and search engines employ sophisticated algorithms that curate reality based on engagement metrics, not truth. These algorithms create personalized informational silos,
ensuring users are primarily fed content that confirms their existing biases, flattens complex issues into simplistic binaries, and prioritizes emotionally charged material that triggers instinctive reactions over deliberate reasoning. The business model of these platforms depends on this very passivity. A user who is thoughtfully reflecting is not generating data or clicking on ads, making critical thought and unprofitable and therefore discouraged behavior. This digital ecosystem is further amplified by a 24/7 media landscape that thrives on sensationalism and speed, where the race for clicks and viewership sacrifices nuance and depth, presenting the world as a continuous spectacle of crises and controversies that demands emotional response, not analytical understanding. Even our modern workplaces, with their culture of endless productivity and efficiency, often stigmatize deliberation as slow and inconvenient, valuing quick execution over strategic contemplation. When these systems, educational, technological, media, and corporate, converge, they create a powerful, self-perpetuating feedback loop that normalizes superficial engagement with ideas. As the philosopher Noam Chomsky identified in his analysis of propaganda, this is the modern manufacturing of consent, a process no longer managed solely by a central ministry of information, but decentralized and automated, outsourced to code and capitalist incentives that profit from a population trained to consume information uncritically, making true scrutiny not just a marginalized act, but an increasingly difficult one to perform against the tide of engineered acquiescence.
Beneath the surface of our hyper-connected existence lies a profound and often unacknowledged psychological crisis, a silent war of attrition being waged on the human mind itself. The digital world, for all its conveniences, imposes a catastrophic cognitive load, forcing our brains to operate in a perpetual state of high-alert distraction that depletes the very mental energy required for deep, focused thought. This constant switching between tabs, notifications, and streams of fragmented information, a state of continuous partial attention, fractures our concentration, making sustained engagement with complex ideas feel arduous and unrewarding. This cognitive overload actively triggers our brain's most primitive defense mechanisms, pushing us to rely on a suite of mental shortcuts and biases to navigate the deluge. We fall prey to confirmation bias, instinctively seeking out information that validates our pre-existing beliefs while actively avoiding dissenting views, thus fortifying our intellectual silos. We succumb to social proof, outsourcing our judgment to the likes, shares, and perceived consensus of the digital crowd, mistaking popularity for truth. This environment doesn't just encourage superficial thinking, it systematically rewires our neural pathways through what neuroscientists call neuroplasticity, training the brain for rapid skimming and instant gratification while weakening the circuits responsible for deep reading, critical analysis, and the formation of long-term memory. The consequence is a diminished capacity for what is known as System 2 thinking, the slow, deliberate, and logical mode of cognition, leaving us stranded in the reactive, emotional landscape of System 1. This neural shift has a direct and damaging emotional corollary, a culture of intellectual intolerance for the essential discomfort of cognitive dissonance. The mental friction that arises when we encounter challenging facts is now routinely avoided. Instead of working through the dissonance to achieve a higher resolution of understanding, we are conditioned to retreat into the safe, validating spaces of our digital tribes, where complex issues are reduced to simplistic binaries, and our worldviews are constantly reinforced. This environment doesn't just encourage superficial thinking, it creates a fragile, reactive psyche, where identity becomes fused with ideology and any challenge to a belief is perceived as a personal attack, leading to heightened anxiety, intellectual rigidity, and a pervasive fear of being wrong.
In the end, the digital world is not merely changing how we think, it is fundamentally altering our relationship with thinking itself, transforming it from a journey of curious exploration into a desperate, defensive scramble for cognitive safety and tribal belonging, leaving us mentally exhausted, emotionally volatile, and estranged from the deep reflective and ultimately human capacity for reasoned judgment. When a society collectively abandons the rigorous discipline of questioning, it does not simply stagnate, it actively unravels, setting in motion a chain of consequences that corrodes the very foundations of democracy, progress, and human autonomy. The most immediate and dangerous effect is the creation of a cultural vacuum where manipulation flourishes, as an unquestioning citizenry becomes the perfect substrate for demagogues, predatory corporations, and malicious state actors who weaponize simplified narratives and emotional propaganda to bypass reason and engineer consent. This leads to a catastrophic erosion of public discourse, where complex, nuanced issues from public health and climate science to economic policy and social justice are flattened into tribal warfare and simplistic slogans, making collaborative problem-solving and evidence-based policymaking impossible. Within this environment, institutions of authority, whether governmental, corporate, or media, face no meaningful scrutiny, allowing corruption and incompetence to thrive in the shadows, shielded from the disinfecting light of public inquiry. This intellectual decay fosters a culture of aggressive anti-intellectualism, where expertise is dismissed as elitism and gut feelings are privileged over verified data, creating a fertile ground for rampant conspiracy theories and a pervasive distrust in the very concept of a shared objective reality. The psychological impact is equally devastating, as individuals, having surrendered their capacity for independent judgment, experience a profound sense of powerlessness and anxiety, which in turn drives them deeper into the comforting embrace of authoritarian figures or rigid ideological groups who promise certainty and order. This dynamic, famously explored by thinkers like Erich Fromm in his analysis of the escape from freedom, reveals how the burden of intellectual self-determination becomes too heavy, leading people to willingly trade their autonomy for the security of dogma. The result is a civilizational paralysis, where the creative friction of debate and dissent, the engine of scientific, artistic, and social progress throughout history, is extinguished. Without a population capable of asking why or what if, innovation withers, moral courage falters, and the society loses its ability to adapt, self-correct, and envision a better future, ultimately becoming a hollowed-out shell vulnerable to collapse from within and manipulation from without, destined to be governed not by the wise and the thoughtful, but by the most ruthless and unprincipled voices in the room. In the face of this pervasive cognitive decay, reclaiming our intellectual sovereignty is not merely an academic exercise, but a profound and urgent moral imperative, a conscious, daily rebellion against the currents of passive conformity. This reclamation begins with a courageous and deeply personal act of will, the deliberate decision to re-engage the mind's dormant faculties of critical judgment, a process that demands we move beyond mere consumption and into active, skeptical engagement with every idea we encounter. It requires the cultivation of what the ancients called phronesis, or practical wisdom, the ability to thoughtfully navigate the complex and ambiguous terrain of modern life by questioning the sources of our information, dissecting the underlying logic of arguments, and relentlessly interrogating our own most cherished assumptions and biases. This journey starts with the disciplined practice of metacognition, or thinking about our own thinking, where we must constantly ask ourselves not just what we believe, but why we believe it, examining the origins of our convictions and honestly assessing whether they are built on a foundation of evidence or simply on the shifting sands of social conformity and emotional comfort. We must actively train our brains to tolerate and even welcome the discomfort of cognitive dissonance, recognizing this mental friction not as a threat, but as the essential growing pain that accompanies the expansion of understanding, a signal that we are on the verge of learning something new. This path demands that we intentionally curate our informational diets, seeking out perspectives that challenge rather than comfort us, and engaging with opposing viewpoints not with the intent to demolish them in debate, but with the genuine humility to understand them, acknowledging the inherent limitations of our own knowledge. It is about rediscovering the value of slowness in a world that worships speed, taking the time to pause before reacting, to sit in silence with a complex problem, and to read deeply on a single subject, thus rebuilding our capacity for sustained attention. This is, at its heart, a spiritual and philosophical stance, powerfully echoing the Socratic conviction that the unexamined life is not worth living. It is a commitment to valuing truth over tribal allegiance, clarity over comfort, and the difficult freedom of self-determination over the seductive ease of intellectual servitude. By making this choice, we do more than just improve our own judgment. We become indispensable nodes of clarity and reason within our social networks, quietly influencing our circles through the rigor of our questions and the depth of our understanding. This individual awakening is the essential catalyst for a much larger cultural renewal, a quiet revolution of the mind that can, person by person, restore the intellectual integrity and moral courage necessary to build a society that is not merely informed, but truly wise, resilient, and free.